Okay. Welcome back to another episode of the Procurement and Finance Coffee Break. I'm here as always with Richard Beaumont, procurement guru, and today we have Jon Bumstead joining us as a guest to interview. Jon's specialty is supply chain and decarbonisation and data transparency. Jon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good morning, Claire, and good morning, Richard.
Right.
Well, supply chain and sustainability sort of define my career, really. I've probably spent equal amounts of time in each. And so the fusion of both two things makes sense for me. My background is I spent probably 13 years of my life helping build the global supply chain practice with Accenture back in the 90s. And the early noughties, and then went on to joined the board of DHL. And that's where my first interaction with carbon and sustainability came about, when it landed on my desk as to what to do. And that's probably going back 15, maybe 20 years ago now. And the first thing you start to do is to try and measure. And in those early days of trying to work out exactly what you're measuring, you come up with some big surprises. The surprise number one was DHL's global footprint probably equaled the size of the emissions of Africa. And I'm not joking. And
Wow.
that's probably when your first sort of oh my God moment, of the size and scale of this challenge. And it was probably there that we decided, how do we go about decarbonising the thousands of buildings, warehouses, offices, trucks, aircraft, etc. And what you realize you need there is engineering know-how, how to decarbonize building, take energy and carbon emissions out from all of that. And so that's really how Neutral started as a startup inside DHL, to look at specifically that, to bring engineering and data and know-how to bear and to deliver outcomes around that. And that was going to define the rest of my career, really, that moment. So, probably 15 years ago, we took Neutral supply chain outside DHL and started working with larger corporates, helping them with their supply chains and their supply chain emission strategies around all that. And I'm happy to work with all kinds of very interesting organizations all over the world in terms of that. And then more recently, I've realized that the corporate business is not the totality of our emissions. There also is what I call the not-for-profit sector, where I woke up in the middle of COVID and said, how do I decarbonize my own home? And others started to ask me the questions, well, if you did it, can you help me? And so that was the formation of Neutral Home. And it wasn't just homeowners that came. It was charities, it was schools, it was hospices, it's churches. And so the two businesses today, one, Neutral Supply Chain, focuses on global supply chains and the decarbonisation of, and the Neutral Home really focuses on the not-for-profit sector. It keeps me plenty busy.
I bet it does. As avid viewers, and we have obviously tens of thousands of them, will know, I'm procurement, yes, but I have a particular focus on ESG because of the role that procurement can play in driving it. So on the one hand, as you've just explained, lots of motivators to decarbonize and find ways to do that. But irrespective of where you are on the journey to do it, you've got to report where you are. And the burden for reporting, whether it's Scope 3 or CSRD or CBAM, it doesn't matter. We're going to talk later about the ever expanding regulatory environment. But from my perspective, the biggest challenge with being able to do any kind of ESG reporting, even just focusing on CO2 as one of them, is the information, the quality of data. And I'd love to just ask you, is that the only problem, or how many other problems are there in terms of companies genuinely being able to report ESG performance?
Well, it is a real challenge. I mean, we've spent probably hundreds of years, honing and perfecting the art of financial accounting. And we actually now realize when we started in DHL, we actually started using the word carbon accounting because we
Right.
realized even back then that we wouldn't go on to need the granularity and the disciplines that you were going to be needed for this. But what was the state of the data that we actually had? Well, we didn't even have any, frankly.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah.
you're starting really from scratch. And as you go through that process, you start off with things closer to home. We call the scope 1 and 2 emissions, your own emissions around it. And we've probably spent the last 15 years finding out the difficulties and challenges of reporting that. Now we enter into the supply chain space, the scope 3 emissions, as they're called,
Yeah.
and that's much harder.
Yeah.
It's so the truth is you can't, the old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure.
Yeah.
And without data, as we say here, all you have is opinions. So
Right.
into all of that. So this is important. So it goes beyond, I think, simply reporting for reporting's sake. Yes, there are requirements. Yes, they will change around all of that. But if your only purpose is simply to comply with that, I think you're missing out on the real reason for
Totally
doing it.
agree.
Yeah,
Yeah. Completely agree. It's reporting is not the purpose. It should be the announcement of the results you've got in improving the performance that matters.
absolutely.
Funny.
Mm.
Funny.
Interesting. So just to sort of expand that out a bit, I think it'd be useful to perhaps give an example. I know when we previously spoke, um, we talked about like how even something as simple as the type of airplane you're using for air freight could drastically change your emissions, but that data isn't always apparent from the information you're provided. Perhaps you could just expand on that, just to explain how even when you've got a fair idea of what's happened in the supply chain, how something as fundamental as the type of airplane or the type of carrier being used would have a massive impact on the calculation of carbon emissions.
It certainly will. I mean, with the last 30 years and the globalization of supply chain, the use of aircraft and air freight has increased. And frankly, air freight is something which you sort of almost say is the level of issues you have in the supply chain. And so where we've been through, major disruption events like COVID and the geopolitics we've got at the moment, the level of air freight grows. It's extremely costly, but frankly, it becomes an addiction. And
Yeah.
organizations then learn to rely upon it because their supply chains are not functioning around it. So you have this level of addiction. And I've definitely heard that word used amongst supply chain executives, say, how can you cure us of this addiction? The challenges on emissions is that air freight is probably tenfold bigger than probably other forms of transportation. So therefore, if you're going to measure it, you want to measure it quite accurately because it's going to matter. And and simplistically put, Claire, is you say, well, okay, it's really quite straightforward, isn't it? Here is the amount, here's the mass that we want to move from A and B. Here is the distance. Multiply it by the average intensity factor, and Robert is indeed your brother's uncle, yeah, as they say. No. No, unfortunately, it's a very wide average. First question is, has it actually gone A to B directly, or has it more likely gone via a transshipment hub? It's gone via somewhere else, but you didn't know about that in the process. Secondly, what was the actual route taken? Yeah, because the air routes could be quite different around it. And what was the nature of the aircraft it flew in? Was it an old one? Was it, a 747, or was it indeed one of the more modern A350 freighters? 40% difference in consumption.
Right.
In those factors there. And lastly, what was the fuel? Was it standard aviation fuel, or was it what we call today sustainable aviation fuel, SAF, into all of it? Suddenly, those three factors have created huge disparity against what we call the average of averages. So if you're really trying to measure something quite simplistically using what we call the average of averages effect, it's hardly going to work. And if indeed you're looking to try and make improvement on the back of that, maybe 5-10%, you're way outside the margin of error in those processes. So you need to know more. You need to know more about that actual shipment and the details it's moved on. And you may be very surprised that the actual result is quite different. And therefore the decisions you took quite different as a result of knowing that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love this because to bring it to life, even if you're thinking, if you were just looking at it from a cost perspective, right? If I put my McKinsey hat back on and I look at projects I did to reduce spend on freight, and as you say, air freight, it is an addiction, and last minute, rather than sort of slower rates of delivery, become the be all and end all of customer service. But understanding the cost comes down to, as you say, what was the route? Was it transshipped to the hub? What were the warehousing and maybe ground transport arrangements in order, for hub? Did it move between two different airports, which I've seen particularly in the US?
Yes.
And when you think about it, if I was talking to a CFO about what is the cost, cost of goods sold, right, and indirect cost of transport of a product, I don't know a single CFO on the planet will say, well, I'm happy to work on a sort of a benchmarked average calculated over the last 2 years on price per kilogram per mile, as long as it's roughly plus or minus X%. Good enough for me. It would never, ever happen, ever. And yet with ESG, that's where we are. And the reason that we're having to make those assumptions is because, as you say, we actually haven't got the data to do the sums on. I guess, where I now see it from a procurement point of view, and this isn't just about, let's be honest, this isn't just being pushed by ESG, it's being pushed by the realities of conflict globally, loss of safe shipping routes through the Suez for various points of time, potential problems coming up with the Panama Canal, depending on what goes on, with our North American colleagues. And, I'm observing lots of companies are rethinking global supply chains and either moving to nearshoring or at least regionalization of where they're manufacturing, where they're producing, and obviously then the supply chains that are matched to it. I mean, what's your, you can get figures like, McKinsey saying, well, 60% of companies are thinking about it. But actually, what's your observation on the ground about how companies are behaving now? And is it an ESG driven thing, or is it really a continuity of supply driven thing? What where on the balance is the motivator?
Well, if you really chart my career, we've charted really 30 years of globalization. Of the idea of how can we put the thing we need as far away as possible from the person that needs it, and convince ourselves that we are doing a good thing here. Into all of that. That was always the supply chain dilemma, and trying to make that work through it. I believe we've come to the end of that era, and in fact, I think we've been coming to the end of it for some time. In fact, I think this phenomenon, which I call supply chains coming home, has been happening for 10 years. And
isn't there a song about that, or is that a football anthem?
I think it related to football.
Oh, okay, right, fine. But it's the same idea, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 30 years of hurt. Yeah. Into all of it. And I do apologize for inflicting those strategies on multiple organizations down the years.
We all did.
Didn't we?
We all did.
And I think what's really come from that is accelerating now. And I think accelerating not because of emissions, if I'm really honest. It's accelerating because of disruption, of COVID, of resilience, of issues, and that global supply chains were very easy to break, hence the air freight addictions, etc. But now geopolitics. And that's been around for 10 years. But, most recently we're seeing now politics and tariffs come into play. So organizations have been migrating to regionalization, making things on the continent they sell them for a while, but it's not enough. Because for those that have migrated to serve, America, for example, from Asia, have moved their capacity to Mexico, it's not enough. We're probably thinking more national now. So, that concept of supply chain coming home, very real into all of this. Now, is this just a period we're going through, or is indeed defining it? Now, again, if you look through the carbon lens, that makes a lot more sense. Things closer
Absolutely.
together, in terms of that, and in terms of also cost, the actual cost of fuel, the cost of energy to do these things becomes a lot more important in all of it. So I think this is here to stay. I don't think it's going to be a short-term thing. And I think one of the challenges, the reason we globalized in the first place was to go out and look for low-cost labor.
Yeah.
And now what we're doing is bringing them home to higher cost locations. So we're going to have to think very hard about productivity. We're going to think very hard about automation and technology
Yeah.
to be able to make this, because unfortunately the customers have got used to the lower prices. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to, because I know Claire wants to talk to you about
I've
regulatory.
got a cheeky additional question too.
I know. Well, I'm going to go first because I'm feeling bossy. I just have you actually just brought something to mind, and you said it at the end. Consumers have got used to lower cost, right? Could you ever see a world in which the price that you pay for a product is set incorporating the environmental impact of getting it to you? So, if I buy an expensive product from the UK, it comes with a low tariff. If I bring something from China, which is nice and cheap on the Amazon website, but I know that's, as you just said, that's a nonsensical way of buying a £9.99, book, that actually I get whacked with almost 100% because of the CO2 and environmental. I mean, do you think that there is a world in which we would see that beginning to happen, and maybe that offsets, as you say, some of that productivity cost issue that comes with, reshoring things in more expensive labor markets?
Richard, I wish I could say yes.
Right.
For a generation now, we talked about, the green premium. Can you charge more for a greener, cleaner product? The first question is you've got to prove it. But I think
Yeah.
I think the consumer experience and the evidence is that the consumer or the customer will pay a cent more for a product.
Right.
That said, if indeed there is a choice and there is price parity or a degree of a little bit of price elasticity around that choice, with other factors into play, then if you can present a cleaner alternative, you will be preferred. Yeah,
Yeah.
into that space. So it's not. I think that the evidence is that no one's prepared to pay more for a green product, but don't think that they're all what's the word? They're not. They're not. They don't care about it. They do care about it. Is they want that product at that cost roughly in that proposition, but you need to demonstrate it is cleaner.
Yeah.
And that's where measurement really or provenance really comes in. So my sense, I've seen it number of times in the last 10 years, is people thinking of launching products with those strategies. It's just when the rubber hits the road, the consumer doesn't pay more.
Maybe it's a smarter way of doing tariffs, eh?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, indeed, and into those things, and some of the costs that you bear into all of it. So it's beholden on us as supply chain professionals to find inventive ways of getting that at the similar cost to there, or a similar proposition. Yeah.
And I've been rude, so I'll hand over to Claire now.
So I have one last question on the regulatory landscape, but before I ask that, you said something really interesting earlier about how and giving them an accountant, this sort of rang some bells, how the evolution of financial reporting had come about over hundreds of years. And it occurred to me, like, the point you were making about data. So we have UK GAAP, we have international standards, and those have evolved over hundreds of years. And at the core of them is a data model for financial reporting. But what you're saying is actually, we have a problem of data, and there's actually no there's no data model in law. There's no data
Yeah.
model enacted for ESG and sustainability that needs to be at the core of people's ERP systems in order then they can pass this data, up the supply chain to the final customer. What's your thoughts around that? Do you think that's likely to be something that comes about in future? Because I mean, without that, if you think about financial reporting, without that accounting data model being your backbone, you can't report financial information. It appears to me that we've got legislation coming out, but we haven't got the backbone to report it.
I think it's early days, and I think each industry is beholden on them to set the standards. So take, for example, the logistics industry, for example, it's to set the standards around, and they are coming. There are definitions around and people have put the time in to say, we think we all should compete on a fair and level playing field, and that this is the information that we need to collect around it. Now, much of this has been spoken around that, but there's also a practicality of whether they think that information is actually available to all of this. So those frameworks have been built on using average factors. That's fair enough for the state, for the maturity it's at the moment. But I believe it will need to go further and go to as you very eloquently put earlier, Richard, to actuals. No one's going to base on that. But I think to begin with, it will start with averages, and I think it's beholden on that. The EU obviously is introducing controls and tariffs based on CBAM at the moment, where it's starting with 5 major commodity groups and asking the question, look, rather than us unwittingly import emissions, let's see if we can have everyone on the same playing field here with, so that they're on the same basis as the European manufactured goods who have to then report their emissions accordingly. So look, I think that will happen. Here's the challenge is reaching out for those standard groups. Will those standards move as fast as they need to? But I think we'll have to be practical about all of this and realize they will come, and we'll have to do this. The challenge is going to be is as we particularly move to scope 3, every customer is going to ask every supplier for the information, almost the same information, that pertains to them. So we're going to have a flurry of requests passing up and down the supply chain. And can we find a smarter way of doing it by putting it on platforms around these common definitions, to that, so that the same action doesn't have to, every supplier has to supply every customer the same information. There'll be armies of people on both sides trying to countermeasure all of this. Is there better platforms out there that will help to standardize and synchronize this? Yeah.
I agree. Okay. That, funny enough, guess where my startup is in exactly that space. How do we simplify the burden of communicating the same information? Because it's non-starter.
And I think if you can evolve it over time to say, look, we start off with what's practical now, average information, and get the base, transactional data, but start to look your data model. My view is make it sophisticated for the future, so it's future proof. So as more and more actual information comes around, you can embed it, and rather than being a prisoner of the past saying, oh, we only ever thought we'd need averages, right? No, I would build it to have actuals, because I think that's clearly going to come. The question will be how long.
I'm going to admit something before we wrap up. I'm going to admit something, and Claire, cover your ears, because I don't want you to hear this. You will never hear procurement say, I'd love more involvement from finance in my day-to-day work. But I'll be really honest. I actually think that because particularly in Europe, the fact that under ISSB, these are going to become, regulated accounts produced to the same standard as financial reporting, which automatically means particularly listed companies are handing responsibility to the CFO. And I'm seeing in lots of companies, senior finance professionals being moved across into sustainability reporting. So there's that consistency of methodology. I actually believe the shift to finance getting control of the numbers for reporting processes is going to do that thing that shifts it along, because quite rightly, finance don't accept fudges. And therefore, that push for accuracy of data is going to come because people won't sign stuff to say, I'm content, this is a fair and accurate, report, unless they're confident that they can prove it. And I actually think that involvement of finance is going to be transformative, because it will drive accuracy through a demand for accuracy.
Now,
Okay,
so moving on just to our final question, and just for the awareness of viewers, in case you're not sure what CBAM stands for, it's the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which requires importers to report embedded emissions in their products. Jon, the regulatory landscape is shifting fast, with the EU introducing more carbon taxes, as I've just mentioned, CBAM, plus with recent political changes in the US, with the election of Donald Trump and him pulling back from certain climate agreements. It's announced that they're going to drill for more oil, for example.
Yeah.
How should businesses be preparing for an uncertain regulatory future? Because it's all well when you know what's going to happen and the course is set, but it seems that the course is not set in many countries at the moment.
No, great question.
I think expect the unexpected. We live in interesting times, and we live in increasingly turbulent times, and I think that the political agenda of the US has given voice to climate skeptics. They were always there in this process. Trouble is that no one actually told the climate this. It's carrying on doing what it's going to do, which is to provide greater and greater shocks to the system. We've seen many, recently the fires in Los Angeles, prior to Christmas, the flooding in Valencia. It will show up and it will do what it says. Now, a long time ago, we said the cost of doing something is big, but it's dwarfed by the cost of doing nothing. Maybe 5 times difference was predicted, and here it is. So for example, if we see the cost of coffee going up, it's because of the climate risks in the sourcing markets that's happened. Truth is, 10 years ago in Paris, we signed up to 1.5 degrees, but we didn't do it. Now we're talking whether 2 degrees is even achievable in the process. So the one key thing that I would be saying to organizations is, look, climate change is happened, it's happening, and it's going to accelerate. Where do you run risks today? Because we're not going to stop it. We may be able to mitigate the really extremes of all of it, but it's going to happen, and therefore where will it impact you in these places? And take a real look through the risk lens as to say what might well happen. Now the supply chain guys are going to be saying, well, if we have disruption, geopolitical, if we have climate disruption, it's going to impact us in getting things from A to B, and probably why it underlines having things closer together makes more sense in this world. So I think that's the environment there. Secondly, I think that just because we all get very noisy at the moment politically and say, oh, we can't afford net zero, it's all madness, et cetera, whatever, actually underlines what's really happening. The cost of energy actually is falling in renewable sources. That's true. And it's true in Texas, by the way, in this space. So, what we saw, the adoption of renewable energy in the first Trump administration and the second in the Biden administration was about the same. It wasn't driven by the political agenda. So, what you actually see is people saying it's common sense to go after lower emissions because it's lower cost. So there's a number of factors going to be in here, but we're going to see some very noisy process. But the truth is, we didn't get out the traps fast enough 10 years ago. And so we will. And so the one thing I would say to organizations is not just have your carbon strategy and how you plan to abate them, but how you plan to accommodate climate change, because it's going to happen.
Jon, on that note, and in our sort of closing minute, if you were talking to a budding finance or procurement professional looking to start making headway, in this space, I mean, what would be your one piece of advice to get going today?
Well, if we actually look at the economic super cycles, we spoke at the beginning about globalization as a super cycle that drove so many careers, wherever you were in this process here. The next super cycle that we're in now is the transition to the clean economy, where
Right.
trillions of dollars are going to be spent, industries are going to be built, opportunities are going to exist. I actually say to young engineers coming in today, it's a wonderful time to be an engineer because there's so
Gotcha.
many very interesting problems to solve for that. In finance, in terms of here, there's a lot of change that we're going to go through here, and there is a tremendous amount of opportunity. Don't see the climate and ESG world as a problem. Don't see it as that. See it as a massive opportunity that for the next 25 to 30 years is going to define us one way or the other around it. So careers will be built in this space, and fortunes will be made. And so look at it that way and look at the opportunity. 15 years ago, I decided I was going to dedicate myself to this, not because I wanted to make a fortune. It's because I actually wanted to make a difference,
Absolutely right.
and
Absolutely right.
this is, and I've had so much fun doing it,
Even better.
so much
Perfect.
interest doing
Perfect.
it. So I would not wish to deny that to a young professional coming into the industry today. I think it's a great opportunity.
I could not agree more. Jon, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Great insights. And you're right, if you can find an opportunity and that ties to a passion, then what a great career, right?
Absolutely.
Just lovely.
Richard, Claire, thank you.
Look, pleasure's ours. And for those that are watching this, look, I hope you've learned something, but also been inspired to go and see what you can do to, as we said, supply chains coming home, contributing to the green economy, and actually making a difference for things today and for the future. As always, let us know what you think. And more importantly, if there's a topic you would like us to talk, or you want to come and talk about a topic, just drop us a line and we will be delighted to host you. But for today, Claire, thanks for the homework. And Jon, thanks ever so much for sharing what I think is a really brilliant piece of work in a really important space. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.